related to mandates, to mandate or not to mandate. I guess that is the question, and whether or not that is even a question for your organisation, given that you may have had it taken out of your hands through various state and territory public health order processes, or indeed industry-specific directives. So look, what we'll do is we'll jump straight into a screen share here. And for those that may not have used a platform called Mentimeter before, it won't be difficult for you. I've just got to jump over here and get us ready. But you'll see in a second, if you want to follow along with us on your smart device, whether that be a smartphone, iPhone, Android phone, it doesn't matter. What I'll get you to do is just confirm that we can all see that. Can I get a thumbs up for everyone? Just checking we can all see it. Yep. So if you haven't already done it, just grab a smart device and just jump on. So make sure you don't do mentimeter.com. Just jump onto a browser and go menti.com, www.menti.com, and then just bash in that code, and you will get this presentation come up that you can follow along with us. So we don't have any sort of trickery or gamification today, but we just wanted to make sure that for those that might have patchy audio or patchy video, they can just follow along on their smart device.
And the code's there on the top of the screen at 90797754.
What I'll do is I'll just chuck it in the chat as well, just in case anyone is having 9079 754. That's right, isn't it?
Yeah.
Okay, that's just in the chat. And look, send us a direct message if you're having any dramas with the platform. We can troubleshoot that for you, but it's just a nice, fun, interactive way to have a conversation. All right, so let's get going, because a good meeting is an efficient and a concise meeting. All right, so pretty much I feel like we're at this point now, aren't we? Like everyone's just like COVID. Can we stop talking about it? Can we stop hearing about it? Thankfully, we've seen the death of 1,000 cuts by the daily numbers update drop out of the media, which I think is good for everyone's mental health, probably more than anything else.
Correct.
But look, we did say, as we said, we did say that it would be really important to cover this topic today, because it is a very pertinent one that will probably affect most of your organisations, or is currently affecting most of your organisations. So what are we going to cover? Current context, legal and case law update, and I'm going to throw to Bronwyn and Chris McCourt for that. We're going to have a quick cross-sector discussion. We've got some panellists here with us today that have very kindly offered to share their experience in their sector. Or as always, time for an open conversation and summary and takeaways. And as always, we'll send you the YouTube link for this, and we'll send you the deck from today so you can go back well armed to go and execute on any of these points. So look, let's just start with the technical stuff, and I'm obsessed with GIFs in Mentimeter at the moment, in case you haven't.
I didn't QA this deck before it came up, by the way, people.
So I'll hand over to Bronwyn for that, and I'll stop the share. But look, all I will leave you with is to say that current context in terms of what you may have seen even in the last week is the Kiwi vaccine mandate that came out this morning, for those that may not have already seen it. Various sporting codes grappling with the concepts of whether or not they will be able to or are able to mandate vaccines, either for tennis players, AFL players, cricket players and the like. And then more broadly, a number of different state jurisdictions, which we will talk about in due course, that have independently come out through chief health officers and made, I guess, either sector specific or even state specific requirements around who may or may not or must not be vaccinated. So, Bron.
Okay, all right. So firstly, I just want to say that just being really clear for all the lawyers in the room, this is not legal advice. So I've got that on the recording, just so you know, okay? But as James said, this is probably the most contentious topic for everybody at the moment with regard to mandating or not mandating COVID vaccinations for workplaces. So we did feel that this was a topic worth exploring, given the current environment that we're all working in. So we wanted to give you some practical guidance on how to navigate this in your workplace. So regardless of your beliefs and those sorts of things with vaccinations, we're not going to go down that rabbit hole today. But we really wanted to talk about workplaces and cross-sector and cross-industry workplaces and what's going on. So firstly, I wanted to cover off the guidance that's been issued by the Fair Work Ombudsman, because the Ombudsman has come out and said there are circumstances where organisations may mandate vaccination for workers. And they are being, firstly, when it's required to comply with a specific law, like a state or territory law, and a public health order. So, for example, we know in the Northern Territory that up there are very specific mandated requirements, for example, working with vulnerable people, including remote communities. So the Northern Territory government came out and mandated that. And if you are an industry operating in that sector or working in that sector, then you need to be vaccinated. The second circumstance is when it is detailed or agreed in an enterprise bargaining type arrangement. Or the third circumstance is when it is fair and reasonable to do so. Now that's really interesting, because then the Fair Work Ombudsman then issued a tiered system to help organisations understand when it might be fair and reasonable to mandate these vaccines. And they split it into 4 tiers. So tier 1 is where employees, as part of their duties, they interact with people who have increased risk. So that could be like hotel quarantine or border control staff. So they're in tier 1. Tier 2 is where employees have contact with people who are vulnerable, and that's healthcare and aged care are your prime examples there. And we know that a lot of the vaccinations have been mandated for both aged care and healthcare. Tier 3 is detailed as being where there is interaction between employees and others, so being customers or members of the public, in the normal course of business. So that could be like retail, hospitality, those sort of workplaces. And tier 4 is where there is minimal interaction during the normal employment duties. So they're the 4 tiers. So they go on to say that for workers in tier 1 and tier 2, the mandatory vaccine direction is more likely to be reasonable. In tier 4, it's not likely to be reasonable. Remembering tier 4 is there is no or minimal interaction with others. Could be like office-based work. For tier 3, and that's going to be a lot of us, that depends on the community transmission and the requirement for the workplace to remain open. That would be when it might be considered fair and reasonable. So think about essential workplaces that are open during lockdowns and those sorts of things, and there's a fair bit of interaction. So the first thing that comes to mind for me is Coles and Woolies. Essential, they stay open, and they did throughout a long period of a lot of, certainly in New South Wales and Victoria, escalating cases. So, and we know that Coles, Woolies and Aldi came out last week and detailed their requirements for mandatory vaccinations for their workplaces. So there is more information for you on the Fair Work Ombudsman's webpage in relation to that, including Q&A. So I encourage you to go there and have a look. But that will help you decide what is fair and reasonable for your workplace.
And we've got the resources that we're referring to just at the back of the Menti deck that we'll send out to you today. So that way that'll just give you the prompt to go back and jump on and
we'll send you the links. Yeah, cheers, thanks. So, so what's important is that all organisations take a risk-managed approach to the position your organisation is going to take. Now, it's important to remember that you've got obligations under the Work Health and Safety Act, obligations being to foresee reasonable hazards, and so COVID transmission is probably a foreseeable hazard, and that you have the obligation to manage risks, either to eliminate them, or where you can't eliminate them, you need to minimise them as far as is reasonably practicable. It's important to remember that. But all organisations have those obligations. So doing a risk assessment will give you defensibility to the decisions that your business is taking and the actions that you're going to implement in your workplace. And it's important that you consider various scenarios for your business. So the Fair Work Ombudsman advice has been that in looking at the tiered system, you can't treat your workforce all of this in all the same way. You might have some workers that are in tier 2, depending on their role, and you might have others that are in tier 4. Now, James and I were working with a business last week. They were natural spring water company who bottled water and then went and delivered it to a number of locations around New South Wales, and they wanted advice on mandatory vaccinations. They had some workers who were tier 4, the office workers, but they had other workers who were tier 2 because they were delivering and making deliveries to workplaces that were healthcare and aged care facilities. So they didn't treat their workers in the same tiered system, and the Fair Work Ombudsman has recommended that approach. It's also important to remember that whilst vaccination might be our highest order risk control in the hierarchy of controls, there are certainly others that you should be considering, including masks, air filtration and ventilation, cleaning, sanitation, social distancing and whatnot. So there's lots of risk controls that you can be considering when you undertake your risk assessment. Now, there is more information for you in the standard that came out last year. ISO PAS 45005. Now, that's a publicly available free standard that you can Google. And again, this will be in your links that we're going to send you. That's the general guidelines for working safely during COVID. So there's that standard available, has really good advice in it.
And I was just going to add with that, no doubt, I know at least looking around the room, a number of us have certainly probably already implemented aspects of that standard in the last 24 months within their own organisations, and certainly plenty of the organisations we've worked with, we've helped them shape the basis of their implementation plans around COVID using that standard as a base. So it is good and it is free.
Yeah, and you don't often get these things for free, so go for it. If you don't have it, let us know. We've sent it out previously, but we've got it in a PDF. We can send it again. And again, taking a risk managed approach, worker consultation, all the things you'd expect to see, but really, really good guidance. Now, the other place that you can get information that's more industry specific is Safe Work Australia. On their webpage, they have industry specific information for workplaces, but including industry specific advice on vaccinations. So very helpful to go there and have a look. Use the drop down boxes to apply your industry and have a look at the advice. So look, another related topic here, I'm going to hand over to Chris in a minute, and I'm not going to touch too heavily on this, but it is also worthwhile thinking about your workplace and what might happen if there is a worker who contracts COVID in the normal course of their business. So in May 2020, there was the advice and orders that came out around splitting workplaces and industries into either prescribed industries or other industries. Now, with prescribed industries, they have the COVID-19 presumption. So in those industries, if a worker contracts COVID, it is automatically presumed that they have contracted COVID through the course of their business. They don't need to prove it in order to make a claim. So industries in the prescribed category include healthcare, aged care, disability, retail, hospitality, education, childcare, police emergency services, construction, cleaning, supermarkets, and quite a few others. So I encourage you to have a look at that. In other industries, of course, you would need to prove that you contracted COVID through the course of your employment in order to make the workers' comp claim. For those of you that are in New South Wales, the CIRA webpage certainly has more information in relation to that, but just wanted to put that on the table. But at this point in time, I might hand over to Chris McCourt. Thank you for agreeing to contribute today. All of you that are on here regularly know Chris from Hickson's Lawyers, and he's agreed to take us through just some examples of some current case law and cases and appeals that are underway in various jurisdictions in relation to COVID vaccine in workplaces. So thank you, Chris, and I'll hand over to you.
Thanks, Bron. Just while you're talking about the workers' comp claims, I'll just give my normal plug and spiel on it around be wary of the psychological claims that come from it. When you have a look at the CIRA data, there are quite a number of claims there that are psychologically based. I think we're talking about a third of the claims that have been lodged are actually in relation to psych claims. I can't confirm that exactly, but I'll look it up before the end of the presentation and get back to you. I'd also just like to flag, I didn't focus on workers' comp for this, but there has already been a decision about a death matter for a guy that travelled. He travelled to the US for work in the medical industry, and it was found that even though he was going into a known hotspot, the workers' comp policy still responded, and the family have received those benefits. So the decisions are starting to come through in that space. But for the purpose of today, I'll see if I can share my screen. Unfortunately, my presentation is not as pretty as Bron and James's, so I do apologise for my
No gifts, come on.
No gifts. So I'm just doing a quick view of some of the cases here, and what I've decided to look at, and I'm hoping you're able to see a picture of the Demons winning shot here. Is that what you can see? Yep, excellent. Yeah. So what I'm just looking to focus on is what's relevant to businesses. The key issue that I'll be touching on will be the public health orders and how they've been applied. This instance, I just want to flag because I know that we have a number of people that are traveling between states, and Rupert, you get to hang out in Singapore. There were 3 guys that decided to go to WA to watch the AFL Grand Final. All 3 have been caught and sentenced to jail time. 2 of the guys have been sentenced to 10 months in jail. And the 3rd, who I'll just focus on, a guy by the name of Cox, has received a 7 months jail term. The reason that they got the jail time comes back to fraud. Actually, they completed all of their documentation to enter WA fraudulently. And Cox, who I just find it very impressive, apparently he was a mate of one of the guys that was playing. He actually went to the extent of purchasing a temporary South Australian driver's license. He procured fraudulent phone and gas bills, and then he applied for his pass to enter into WA with that information. So he clearly really wanted to be there for his mate, so he must be some heck of a good friend. But the magistrate just couldn't cope with that level of fraud, and as a consequence, he's received 7 months. The next one is just a bit of an around the grounds. So having a look at what's happening at the different levels of court around Australia. So the first one I have there is that there was a group of police from Queensland. They took their issues to the full bench of the Industrial Relations Commission. That was rejected on application, and they noted that the police commissioner actually had the power to mandate compulsory vaccines, and it didn't infringe the workers' rights, nor was there any issue with their consultation of staff. The big thing that I found interesting about this case is that there's twofold. The commissioner was upheld by the Industrial Relations Commission, which was interesting. But the second part was the application was actually crowdfunded, and they got up to $118,000 worth of donations. So clearly there's still a little bit of an undercurrent there in the community for them to get enough cash to be able to take that forward. We then head down to Victoria, where a casual teacher who is studying law has decided to take on the Victorian government against posing mandatory vaccinations for teachers. This was meant to start on Monday as a hearing, but it's been adjourned to a later date because she has subsequently joined a second action that started in Victoria, where they have over 119 plaintiffs, varying from authorised workers within healthcare, construction and education. They were all seeking relief against the mandatory vaccination and consider that there's been a breach of the state's human rights charter. So this one will be interesting to follow. The directions hearing for that actually is today. So a directions hearing is just allocating when evidence ought to be served and then considering what date it should be set for hearing. So it's a little bit of watch this space in Victoria. I see Dan is trying to get a few bills through Parliament as well to give him some more power. So it seems to be a moving beast down there. So anyone doing business down there, good luck, because you do need to check it every day, I think, with the way it's going at the moment.
I was going to mention that, Chris, because I know that is a notably contentious piece of media at the moment. So thank you.
Yeah, it's interesting. How about I just won't pass comment. We'll see how he goes when he debates it. If I was to pass comment, that's almost a session in itself, isn't it? That sort of bill. So we'll just leave that parked where it is. The interesting one in New South Wales was a matter of Kazam and Hazard. So Hazard's our health minister, for all those that have been playing at home for the last couple of weeks. The proceedings in the Supreme Court were dismissed, and this one only came down around the 15th of October. So there was two key elements here. The public health order was challenged, and it was accepted that public health orders are good law and they need to be followed. The other part, which I find interesting, and each of these cases is throwing up a slightly different topic here. They challenged the right to body integrity. So the right for the state to enforce you to put something into your body. The findings were that there was no issue to the body integrity because it wasn't enforcing you to do it full stop. It was only a condition of your employment. So that was one of the findings of the court. Unclear if that's going to be challenged as yet. They're still within their time to appeal. So I think it definitely will be a bit of a watch this space, because there were quite a few plaintiffs in this one as well. And a lot of issues that could really be sorted out on appeal and will make our job as lawyers a lot easier, that's for sure, with advice. The one that I do want to talk in a bit of detail about is a matter of Kimber versus the Sapphire Coast Community Aged Care Limited, otherwise known as Sapphire. For those who may have been following this actually goes back to the public health order for the flu vaccine that was given out in, I believe it was May and June last year. March and June last year, where to work in an aged care facility, one had to be vaccinated with the flu vaccine. So Miss Kimber decided to refuse to comply with the requirement to be vaccinated against influenza. She sought medical grounds to have her position supported, but it was found that there was a valid reason for her to be dismissed. It was procedurally fair, was not harsh, unjust, or reasonable. I will come back to touch on the medical grounds, because this case is interesting on that basis, because she alleges that she was unable to be vaccinated due to a medical contraindication. So just as a little bit of background in this matter, Miss Kimber, she was a receptionist at a community aged care facility, and she was then fired, I guess is the most blunt term for it, for her refusal to receive a flu vaccination. So for those who don't remember, back to March 2020, which seems like a lifetime ago when we were footloose and fancy free almost, there was a public health order that came out with regards to COVID-19, and it stated that employees in aged care facilities must be vaccinated for influenza, and the particular Sapphire aged care facility noted that their staff needed to be vaccinated from the 1st of May 2020, and any unvaccinated staff would not be able to access their facilities and would likely be dismissed. So Miss Kimber declined the vaccination and she was dismissed in accordance with the public health order. She then supplied her employer with a influenza medical contraindication form. Sorry, I always get tripped up on that. As was defined in the June public health order, where people could seek a medical exemption for receiving the flu vaccine. Sapphire determined that the form was actually invalid and maintained her dismissal of employment. What was actually interesting here was that the medical condition that she alleged to have suffered as a result of a previous vaccination was not actually supported by her treating doctor. She had been seeing a Chinese herbalist for it. She had the form that was required under the June public health order completed by her doctor, who had not treated her, and the medical condition that she was suffering from was not recognized as a reaction to the influenza shot that she had. So on that basis, the commissioner was not satisfied that her dismissal was, to quote, harsh, unjust, or unreasonable, and her application has been dismissed. She did apply for appeal on the basis that she wasn't provided with procedural fairness. And in the conscious of time, I won't take you through the details of that, but the short version is it was again found that there was no objective medical contraindication. Oh God, I'm struggling on that word. My apologies, everyone. To the vaccination. So on a second hit, she still didn't get through there, and her appeal was knocked back. The interesting part on this is that the dissenting opinion from Deputy President Dean was actually quite controversial. She actually wrote that she really strenuously disagreed with the outcome and considered that the current public health orders move beyond the minimum necessary requirements to achieve public health aims and manage the risks. And instead they instituted blanket rules which locked out objectors from accessing society through coercive measures. Unfortunately, she also then went on to say, and I'm quoting here, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the Nuremberg Code freely giving consent to any medical treatment, particularly in the context of a clinical trial, is not optional. Coercion is completely incompatible with consent, and denying a person the ability to work and participate in society if the person does not have a COVID vaccine will unquestionably breach this fundamental and internationally recognized human right. She further went on to say, because she just wanted to give people plenty of reasons to lodge actions against COVID vaccine, was that it is highly likely that the dismissal of an employee who fails to have a COVID vaccine will breach the Disability Discrimination Act 1992 and the exemption within the Discrimination Act will not be protected by the public health orders. So finally, she provided a very intense summary of her decision by saying, all Australians should vigorously oppose the introduction of a system of medical apartheid and segregation in Australia. This aberrant concept is morally and ethically wrong, and the anaesthesis of our democratic way of life and everything we value. In this regard, one can only hope that the majority decision is recognised as an anomaly and not followed by others. So clearly, the decision there by the full bench was that the matter was rejected, and the application provided by Kimber was not supported by any of the evidence that she had provided. The challenge, and what I wanted to flag for everyone there, is even in the courts, we are starting to see some, I guess, civil liberty style freedoms trying to be pushed forth. Does not appear to be in the majority at the moment, but it would be interesting as to which case that goes through and as to how they do get decided into the future. So it is very much a watch this space and an evolving scenario. But at the moment, the public health orders that have been provided under Section 7 of the Public Health Act do appear to be upheld with by the courts. And it's a wait and see out of Victoria and the appeals that we'll see from New South Wales. And that's about all from the around the grounds.
All right, well, thanks, Chris. That was, I mean, there's a few key terms there. If I could just get you to cut your screen share, because we'll go to our sort of targeted discussion now. So, I mean, I know that medical apartheid term is one that we've seen in the media in the last couple of weeks, and certainly an absolute doozy. And I'm not really sure any of us have the time to open that Pandora's box. But I think, look, what I might do quickly just to bring all that together is just show you. So we've talked, for the non-legally trained people in the room, we've talked about some technical side, but we want to really go, all right, well, so what does that boil down to based on the technical side that Bronwyn and Chris have taken us through, in terms of what are your really sort of core 3 essential ingredients for success as an organisation, irrespective of the industry you're in? First and foremost, and I know we sound like broken records when it comes to this, and this is our business, but undertake a risk assessment. If you don't know how, you can talk to us about how, but you need to undertake a risk assessment related to basically everything that Chris and Bronwyn have just said, but I'm not being smart in saying that. A big focus there within that needs to be implementing what they call an inclusive and considered consultation process. And the reason why inclusive is an operative term is because it's in the standard that Bronwyn mentioned. And then lastly, as you can see, particularly from Chris's dissection of a couple of different jurisdictions, you've got some real complexity in these state public health orders. And some of them, it's like, ugh, you know, you just look at it as, are they written to set up to fail? Is what when I read them, I go, they're just written by a bureaucrat. And you know how most of us know how I feel about government and bureaucrats, but you need to understand the complexities of those health orders because they vary so considerably state to state. And probably that's a good segue to launch into the, I guess, the panel section of today. What I thought we might do, Janine, not to put you on the spot, is to go to you first. So what we did was we've asked a couple of special guests to come forward to talk to us about what are they doing within their sector around this crazy spider's web of health orders and mandates and etc. So thank you, Chris. Thank you, Bron, for those great presentations. I'll introduce you to, for those who haven't already met her, Captain Janine Drummond, who is, and I
told you could get that in.
I checked that I could do that before I did that. Janine is a mariner and a marine professional of considerable repute, was the first female harbour master in Newcastle Harbour. So that's a really important and, you know, very significant role to hold. Is also a board member of a number of significant marine related regulatory entities within the country, and also a very experienced consultant in the space as well. So Janine, I'll hand it to you, and really we'd just like to know the marine industry or the marine logistics sector. Yeah, what are you doing? How are they approaching this minefield? So thanks, Janine.
Thanks, James. I'm really delighted you did ask me today to do this, and it would be remiss of me if I didn't just take it up a notch a little bit around seafarers. So please bear with me as I just give a little bit more background to the effect on seafarers and the Australian maritime industry with the pandemic, and then lead into the situation with vaccines. So the COVID-19 pandemic really highlighted the critical work of what I consider our global supply chain's unsung heroes, the seafarers. They've continued to move cargoes around the world, facilitating necessary trade during this whole pandemic. They haven't down tools, they've continued working under some really trying conditions. As the borders closed around the world and the public health orders were issued, seafarers became prisoners on board their vessels. They could no longer enjoy shore leave in the ports they visited. They couldn't pick up personal items that they needed ashore. They had minimal contact with shoreside terminal and port staff. They could no longer easily access essential health care for routine dental or medical concerns, all done via a telehealth service. And if an urgent health appointment was necessary, it was often facilitated under a quick shade on a wharf. During the peak of the pandemic, it was estimated about 600,000 seafarers were stranded on board. They were overstaying their maximum contract periods, often well over 12 months. And finding that with no shore leave or access to no certain plans to being able to return to their homes and families due to the border closures, there was a lack of maritime corridors for seafarers to move through countries. There was a lack of flights for both joining and leaving crews. And sadly, the mental health of seafarers over the past 2 years has really suffered, and there's been a significant increase in suicide rates at sea, as well as the additional health issues that have come from the lack of access. So yet during the pandemic, the major shipping news, as I'm sure you ever heard, was the Ever Given grounding in the Suez Canal. And very little news hit mainstream media of seafarer welfare and what they were doing to ensure all the goods still arrived at our front door. So I've often wondered if the investigation into the Ever Given's grounding had considered the fatigue of the master and navigating crews and how long had they been on board prior to that incident. Now, as I move towards the vaccinations of seafarers, it is really important to protect our global and national and state supply chains from ongoing disruptions, such as the recent examples where container terminals have been shut down in China, Melbourne, Sydney. They all have a flow-on effect, and it is affecting supply chains coming into Christmas. And mostly we need to protect our port workers and families, the port workers who are still interacting with the visiting foreign vessels. We need to make sure that those seafarers also get the vaccinations. So now vaccinating foreign seafarers has been a challenge due to often requiring more than one injection, lack of available stock, lack of willingness, wanting to do community first, lack of ways of being able to verify their identification and digital evidence of their vaccination. Some countries around the world have prioritised this and have made it easier with vaccinations that only needed one injection, while other countries have been slow to understand the importance of vaccinating seafarers, Australia included. While government have mandated vaccines for our essential and frontline workers such as teachers, aged care, port workers have yet to be mandated that I'm aware of. However, I suspect this may fall into the category Bronwyn mentioned earlier around fair and reasonable. Majority of port workers have voluntarily had the vaccine, and industry employers are developing further policies and guidance regarding this vaccination process. These workers have been operating in high COVID risk environments for some time, and to the earlier point, have some very robust processes around PPE, sanitisation, segregation and cleaning procedures in place. I personally feel that this interaction with foreign visiting vessels still remains a critical risk on our supply chains and the health of these workers and to the communities in which they live. So I expect we're going to hear a lot more about this point with the port interfaces around Australia and the world. The biggest challenge, and you touched on this earlier, with port and maritime is the different views and regulations of each state without an overarching federal plan for states to follow a similar framework, especially as we have port workers who are often fly in, fly out across the country, vessels that move between our state ports, where vaccination repatriation programs are all being managed very differently. It's not providing continuity for businesses to be able to plan ahead what they need for their crew welfare as well as for their supply chains. I hope that gives a little bit of an insight into maritime industry in Australia and around the world as well.
Thank you. That was fascinating, Janine. Thank you. Just really raised some points that I guess that we hadn't really had considered when it comes to how things arrive at our homes and at our tables. We just get frustrated that, you know, my Amazon order is late.
My lounge took 17 weeks when I ordered it.
Yeah, so no, it was really insightful and very interesting. Thank you.
Yeah, and I think look, what really speaks to us that I think is pretty dear to the heart of a lot of people in this group, Janine, is this threatened supply chain, which I think we've as a group addressed a number of different lenses on over the last couple of years, because it is, you know, whether it's supply chains for people or whether it's supply chains for goods.
Yes.
And I mean that in terms of immigration, you know, et cetera, there's a lot of shock that seems to be going on at the moment, and high levels of volatility in those supply chains. So yeah, that was a great insight. Really, really.
I'm really worried about supply chain. So I made my husband do an online order for my Christmas present over the weekend. So
it was a smart move, Bronwyn. I hope he wasn't too late.
Yeah, that's right. So get in now, buddy, and get my Christmas present.
I know, yeah, because you kind of say, oh, you know, between maritime unions and international supply chain disruptions, yeah, just a lot of volatility. And look, certainly, really appreciate you sharing that. We thank you very much for that insight, Janine, because I guess you might have hinted at it when I saw you the other week for coffee, and I was like hanging off your every word, asking you these lists of very annoying questions. So it's great to understand a lot more about the intricacies of seafaring and supply chain. So thank you. So I'll move over to Jane Panisi now. We've got Jane and Matt to finish off the three. So Jane's a WH specialist and a former corporate banker across a number of different sectors, and these days predominantly focuses on work health and safety consultation to the finance sector and consulting to a number of different sectors, including finance and others. So Jane, welcome, and thank you for sharing your perspective with us today.
Terrific. Thanks, James and Bronwyn. It's great to be part of this forum today. And Janine, so interesting. I could have listened for hours. You know, some of that information that you were talking about and also felt slightly sorry for you, to be honest, thinking all of those things that you need to consider. And I wanted to just share a little less specifically, because I do work across a range of industries, but just share some of my observations and challenges that I'm seeing at the moment. So as James mentioned, I do have quite a strong background in the finance industry and have recently been working with some of the banks. And as you would all know, some of the big four have actually gone ahead and mandated vaccinations. So ANZ, Westpac's just jumped on board, and NAB mandated that for their employees. And a number of the smaller banks have been on a let's not be the leaders, let's wait, sit back, watch and wait, and we'll see where we go from here. But just in the last week, the smaller banks such as BOQ have actually mandated vaccination. And it's been really interesting, and I was asked to provide some support and do some research into their making those decisions. I certainly wasn't making the decisions, but it was really driven because of their geographical spread and having a big footprint in Victoria and New South Wales, and that really determined what would happen nationally. So with those national organisations, they tend to take a national approach and they'll go for the highest common denominator. So for the likes of BOQ, making that decision to mandate vaccination really was driven out of Victoria and New South Wales revealing their roadmaps. And also obviously the individual state mandates, and WA as well. There is certainly trepidation, even though they've made those decisions around, is there potential risks around actions from employees? There has been some discussion, a few employees have already come forward and feel as though it, may fall under bullying and harassment. And that type of thing. So that's going to be a watch, wait and see type of space. And in those type of environments, there's a mixture, and this goes across some other clients I have, where they do have essential workers. So branch employees have been determined to be essential workers and had to stay open. Banks had to stay open through the pandemic. So they have been considered and treated as frontline workers. So in that situation, most of those group of employees are being quite supportive of taking that approach. However, then you have the corporate employees who potentially have been working from home for over 12 months, and the resistance is coming from them because they don't see, that they're at risk or that it applies to them. But, the organisations are taking the approach, do we mandate it for everybody? Or, as Bronwyn mentioned, that tiered approach, because within one organisation you would have different tiers of employees. The other thing that I just wanted to touch on was the challenges for smaller organisations. So a lot of my clients are quite small. They might have 30 to 100 employees. So it's accessing information, access to other people who potentially have already gone down this path. They just don't have those networks. So even just a forum like this is really valuable for me to listen, what the organisations you're working with, and if some of them are smaller organisations, how you're navigating those challenges. But one of my clients is actually a dairy production facility. And we have delivery drivers who go out to supermarkets, small, independent, so your local IGAs, or they might even go to cafes and that sort of thing. So a lot of their smaller delivery sites, cafes and things like that, it hasn't been an issue. But, Woolworths and some of those big ones are now starting to ask, well, it's mandatory for our employees, you deliver, you come on site. So they're starting to ask questions about whether or not the employer will be mandating the vaccinations. And just, I know we're running out of time, but even from a safety and security perspective, what I'm seeing with some of my clients is where these things are being mandated, and this is not just in the branches, but where a decision's been made and then customers are coming in and taking offence at that, either that they have to be vaccinated to enter the premises, or the fact that the organisation has made that decision. They are taking great offence at that and being very verbally aggressive and threatening towards the people. And often they're the younger workers who do have to face into this verbal abuse and threats of aggression and that sort of thing. So when you talked, James, and like you, sometimes people look at me and say, if you tell me one more time to do a risk assessment. But the reality is, it's such a simple way to make sure you capture all those potential risks. And, for anyone who's in this group, I would urge you to even consider physical security as part of your risk assessment when you're looking at COVID and all its iterations and across our different businesses, because that's certainly something that is seeing an increase in the number of incidents of customer aggression, and there have actually already been a number of workers' comp claims for psychological stress, which you touched on, Chris. So that, just trying to keep it short and sweet, but just some other things that I think that we all need to consider as we go down this path. And I think whether you've made the decision or not, there's still a lot to unfold, and potentially it might be some months, even a year, before we see the full implications and what that might mean for us. And the other thing, just my last thing, is just a personal experience. So a client I'm working with for a recent engagement, I had to visit a number of sites all around Queensland, and it was a very awkward conversation, and I wasn't quite sure what they were trying to get at. But essentially, they very awkwardly wanted to ask me of my vaccination status, which was fine. I had no issue with that, and had been double vaccinated, because they had concerns about me travelling from site to site and protecting their employees. Yet they didn't have any position themselves on vaccination status. So, and still haven't made a decision. So I think there's going to be we're going to see a lot of things in that space. And, I wonder if I'd said I wasn't double vaccinated, I'm not really sure what was going to happen then. But yeah, there is still a lot of unanswered questions and a lot of uncertainty. So that was just a personal experience as well. And the other thing is, when they asked me if I was double vaccinated, I asked them if they wanted me to provide them with evidence of it, but they were very concerned about me giving them personal health information and how they were going to manage it. So that's another thing for employers as well. If you do mandate it, how do you verify that people have it? Do you just ask them to do a personal attestation, or do you ask for evidence of it? And then what do you do with the information? So they're just some of the things that I'm working with some of my clients, working through with some of my clients at the moment. So a mixture of some that have mandated, some that haven't, and then personal experience as well.
Thank you, Jane. That was really insightful. Thank you so much. And really interesting to think about your take on particularly younger workers who are on the front line. I know my son works both hospitality and retail and has had experience with customer aggression when being asked to determine vaccination status prior to letting people into venues. So no, thank you, Jane. That was really interesting.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, and I think we'll all now memorably remember the time the time anyone uses the term apartheid and think of that recent Batuta advocate story about the fruit shop customer, local beautician, Merrill, whatever, referring to the medical apartheid being the same as the apartheid in South America, which I was like, that just totally nails the whole the whole essence of misinformation and half-truth that dribbles around social media. So look, last but not least, we'll hand over to Matthew Houston, who's the Director of Infrastructure and Development for the Anandiliakwa Land Council up in the Northern Territory. Matt's in a great and I guess enviable position in a way, in that the Northern Territory Chief Health Officer has brought out quite a strong direction, referring specifically to vulnerable people and defining Aboriginal people and communities as vulnerable. So Matt, I'll hand over to you to give us a summary of what that means for you guys.
Yeah, thanks, James and Bron. Thanks for having me today. I guess I'd just like to start by saying this is something in my space that's been going on for 2 years, and I called on the help of Mindful Risk 2 years ago. And I couldn't be more grateful for that help, because my initial response to COVID-19, and initially, I wouldn't say it was fear, but it was more of a public concern for how my staff operate, and I needed some specialist support. So I came to you guys to help me on 2 parts: business risk in general, and then obviously particularly around the pandemic control and reacting to the pandemic space. So this has been ongoing for 2 years. So the role, and I guess to give everyone a bit of a background, the role that I do with my staff, we're remote project managers that operate in I guess you would say, a service delivery environment, project managing, delivering a whole gamut of projects across the Grid Archipelago, over $100 million worth of infrastructure investment. But we work off-site, based in Queensland, in Cairns. I'm based on the Sunshine Coast. I've got other staff around the country. We're employed through a Commonwealth-owned Aboriginal Land Council that sits in the Gulf of Carpentaria. So there's a whole lot of moving parts there that I'm always trying to watch and keep an eye on, which sometimes can be difficult. And obviously I call on the support of people like James and Bron to help me through those spaces. And there are other specialists in the employment space, legal spaces, things like that. So as we've been going about our work, one of our biggest risks that was obvious to me was my staff sit in Cairns. If they track the virus, they're taking it in onto Aboriginal Trust land in the Northern Territory. How does that work? How do we manage that risk? And we worked through that process. And for a long time, I wasn't in a position where I could even mandate through an employment agreement with my staff to force them to get vaccinated. So we just needed to gently work through that process for the last 2 years and how we went about that. And me basically imploring my staff in the nicest way possible to get vaccinated. It's now come to a point through the leverage that my CEO and myself have with the Northern Territory Government and ComGov, because of our roles and where we're positioned, to influence some really strong mandates that have come out through the Northern Territory Government's Chief Health Officer to actually have some very clear directions around getting vaccinated if you want to work in the Northern Territory, particularly if you're working with vulnerable people, and Aboriginal people fall into that vulnerable category. So I guess just moving through that now, we have this public health order that's off the back of the Public Health and Environment Act 2011. It's basically, I've got to have some steps in place over the next few months leading into Christmas with my staff if they want to come to work and perform their duties. And in James's term, which you're sort of coaching me through this, the inherent duties of their role is the term. We now need to call urgent consultation meetings with my staff and go through that to find out who is vaccinated. I can legally ask them to provide a copy of their vaccination certificate to me and to our HR, and then those documents are stored in accord with our records management policy. And then they're allowed to come to work because we need to be able to show evidence of that to the Northern Territory government. And we've had to work through a range of other things as well, because we contract our work out to construction contractors. Some of those contractors are based on Groote Eylandt, some of them are off-site contractors and consultants who fly into the Gulf from other states. So we had to go through a risk management process there as well, where we had to understand how we could leverage and politely force those people to be vaccinated or manage the pandemic on behalf of us if they're coming to do business with us. And the best way for us to leverage that was through external contracts, whether it be an AS 4000, AS 2000 contract, which then had appendices off the back of it, which James and Bron helped me build those into place, or if they were just standalone contracts that we had with a consultant to prove that they had put all of their steps in place to be not only vaccinated, but how they were just managing the pandemic in general. And I guess if I take off all of these different layers around what we're talking about here, for me, it was just incredibly important that I kept my staff safe, but I also kept the vulnerable people that we work with safe and healthy. That was the most important thing to me. We're working with a cohort of Aboriginal people out in the middle of the Gulf of Carpentaria who have suffered so many disadvantages, and however you want to term it, over the last 150 years, to then bring this pandemic in onto them and threaten their health when they already are in a situation of poor health and other issues they deal with in their day-to-day lives. If myself and my staff were responsible with sharing this virus with them, I would not be happy about that. That's really what it came down to for me, and where my moral compass sat with that and how we're managing through that. So off the back of all of that, we are now having consultation meetings with my staff next week to basically go through those steps and to see who objects. And out of my group of about 15 staff, I do have 2 objections at the moment that are informal, which we're trying to deal with. One of the objections, just to share this with the group, and I don't know if anybody else has gotten to this point, I do have, and it kind of, you start to learn a bit about your staff, a bit more than what you want sometimes, where they stand with their view on the world, and how that, sits with you as a person. One of my staff, he just doesn't want to get vaccinated because he doesn't want to be told what to do by the government. It's as simple as that. He doesn't have any sort of contradicting medical certificate from his doctor. His reason is he just doesn't want to be told what to do. He just sees it as his civil right to make his own decisions in life. And if he's going to be forced to get the vaccination, he just won't do it. I'm not going to unpack that anymore. So that's his view. I have another staff member. She has a range of different immune system issues, but she can't get a contradiction certificate from her doctor. But it's just her feeling that she would rather see her system and her body fight this pandemic with her strongest natural immune system that she can bring forward to the fight, basically. And she doesn't want to get a vaccination because of that, because she believes it'll compromise her immunity. So they're the things that I've got to deal with those people, and respect that. But at the same time, I'm in a position where I have to follow a government health order. It's as simple as that. So look, I might just leave it at that, James.
Yeah, no, look, that's excellent. And I mean, I reckon that encapsulates it really nicely, Matt, that last sentence, that, you want to look after your staff and certainly not kind of, suggested that you're treading on their civil liberties, but you've got a government health order that takes that decision away from you. It's kind of a better position to be in many ways.
But it does also give that sort of, there's going to be lots of legal interest here in relation to, can you perform the inherent requirements of your role if you are required to be vaccinated and you are not? So, that's just, I think, Chris, you said earlier, watch this space. This is going to go on for some time, but, not a difficult position for you to be in, Matt, and we're giving you all our support.
Well, look, I was going to say we've shot the clock by a couple of minutes and we would have liked to have gone to some more open discussion, but I would think that we probably better call it quits. Look, thank you so much to everyone that was joined us today. We'll get the recording out, and I think, look, this is such a hot button issue. Please just, you're all familiar with each other, the majority of you in that email list now. Please just reach out and communicate and chat across that list. That's what we want everyone to do.
Yeah.
And obviously, shoot us a direct message or however you need to get in contact with us if you want to know some more detail. But we'll shoot out the presentation deck and the recording, which is just a link to our YouTube channel after this. And look, we'll see you once more this year at the end of next month. And then we're going to call time. And for those of us that are available to meet in person, we're going to go and get quite boozy at some point before Christmas time. So
face-to-face drinking.
Yeah, that's right. Right. So Daniel, apologies, mate. You can't be with us this time all the way from Queensland, but hopefully next year we'll be joining you again in Brisbane. And Matt, it looks like there's
January, mate.
January, I think. Yeah. So excellent. All right. Well, look, thank you very much, everyone. I hope you have a great rest of the day and a great rest of the week.
Yeah. Thanks, everyone.
Okay.
See you next time.
Bye. Bye.